Let's talk about the details of my story from which I created unconditional boundaries. Right now, today, as I sit, I have lots of people in my life that believe in me, that encourage me, that work with me, that share my values, that like what I like and do what I do and want what I want and think like I think. I have a lot of people who support me in various different ways, some financially, some um, through collaboration, some through advice and encouragement. I've built a life filled with people I love and who love me. And this is a great gift that I am very blessed to have. And I didn't always have it. See, I grew up with no friends. I didn't have very many friends growing up through school. As a matter of fact, most of my school years, I had no friends at all. There was the odd year, maybe two or three of them, where I did have a friend for part or most of the year, but I didn't have very many. I never had more than one, with the exception of I was friends with these twins in high school. And I don't even know if it was high school because it was more middle school, and we became friends in kind of grade nine. Part of the problem was that it took me a long time to learn social skills. I didn't learn those things easily. To this day, I still don't. It takes me a lot of effort and a lot of trial and error and a lot of experimentation because I get things wrong more than I get things right, especially socially. I get things 10 times more often, 20 times, 100 times more often I get it wrong and I insult somebody or I hurt somebody's feelings or I make things worse somehow socially more often than I do it right. But over time, I learned some skills. And I learned those skills because of the process I went through. I grew up with no friends. Yeah. I had virtually nobody to hang out with. Most of my school years, school age years, I had nobody to hang out with. And those times that I did have someone to hang out with, we were only friends because we were usually both the rejects. The people no one wanted to hang out with, so we hung out together. It wasn't because we had anything in common. We weren't friends because they liked what I liked or I liked what they liked or we had any values in common. We weren't friends because our parents were friends. We weren't friends because there was anything that, we liked that was the same. We were friends because if we weren't, we wouldn't have any friends. Nobody else would be our friend. So that those friendships that I did have, even those few years that I did have friends, those friendships were very difficult, strife with conflict, not very fulfilling, and certainly not heartwarming. I did not feel loved at all throughout most of my childhood. As I got older into middle school and high school, I'd have people who saw me struggling to make friends and took pity on me. Teachers, youth pastors, and youth group leaders, and older teenagers, and even some of the pretty girls in my grade would take pity on me, not because they liked me, but because they saw me struggling year after year to make any friends and made none. So these different kinds of people would take pity on me. And I use the word pity carefully here because they didn't actually care about me. What they cared about is there was this person in their school or their classroom or their youth group that was bringing the entire mood of the place down, the reputation of the place or the mood of the place or the like they would rather I just left. But since they didn't have a choice to make me leave, they tried to help me make friends. And they gave me all kinds of advice on how to make friends. And a couple of times they even introduced me to people they thought I might like caring, loving, kind people. But I was so socially awkward, so bad at the social skills that it was very easy for me to insult people, not even trying to. I would try and make a joke about something and it would be completely off color. I would try and compliment somebody and it would be the thing they hated the most about themselves. I would try and share something with somebody and the thing I thought we had in common, we didn't. And even when there was times we had things in common, they didn't want to share them with me, right? I'm reminded of in my teenage years, listening to some of the girls say they wish the guys they dated would treat them better, would take them on dates, would buy them flowers, would kiss them in public, would hold their hands when they go to the mall. They wish these guys that they were dating would treat them more like they wanted to be treated, nicer. And I would come along and I would say, I'll treat you that way. But the problem is they didn't want that from me. They wanted that from their boyfriends, the guys they already looked up to, they already admired and already wanted something from. They didn't want anything from me. As a matter of fact, me trying to do that for them was almost insulting to them because I was never a guy they were looking at. And it was the same with my friends. And that cycle of being really bad at making friends and having select few people here and there take pity on me and show me how to make friends, that continued right through to my mid 20s. There was a couple of times in my early 20s, just like in my school years, where I had friends here and there, but they didn't hang out with me because I had any characteristics they liked. They hung out with me because I was a reject just like them. I was the guy that couldn't have friends just like they were. There was even a group of us in my early 20s that all hung out together. We were all the rejects that nobody wanted to be around, so we hung out together. The problem was, just like in my childhood, we didn't actually have that much in common other than we were all the rejects. We didn't actually like many of the same things. Sometimes we did. We created a scenario of liking the same things sometimes. Like we'd sit down and watch the movie together and we would all like that movie, but really it turns out most of us didn't. So we weren't making friends with people who shared our values or like the same things as us. We were just making friends with people who would say yes. And that's what I ended up making a pattern out of throughout my 20s and 30s. I started making friends with anybody who would say yes, including the girl I ended up marrying in my mid 20s, mid to late 20s. As a matter of fact, I think we were 30, I was 31 when we got married. So all that did was create a pattern of me molding myself into what I thought people wanted me to be. Based on the advice these people were giving me, these people that took pity on me, based on their advice, I was molding myself into what I thought people wanted me to be. And I spent My late teens and all of my 20s trying to do that. Part of my 30s, trying to mold myself into what I thought people wanted me to be, including my wife. And I became quite the people pleaser. Problem is, just as with other people pleasers, nobody was recognizing me for who I am. The problem with us people pleasers is we spend our life trying to get other people to like us so that they'll start meeting our needs, but they never do for two reasons. One, we never show them what those are, because if we show anybody our needs, then they won't like us anymore. And two, if we're people pleasing, we're only being attracted to those people, or we're only attracting those people who aren't interested in your needs. They're only interested in theirs. So they're not interested in our needs. I didn't meet people who were interested in helping me meet my needs. I only met people who were interested in letting me meet their needs. And I found a lot of people like that. I even dated a couple of them. So as I got into my 30s and my 40s, I ran into people saying, well, yeah, you need boundaries. I saw it online. I saw it on social media. I saw it in books. I worked at a couple of different bookstores. There was a lot of books on boundaries. I even read the original Boundaries book by Cloud and Townsend. The problem is when I went to use boundaries, when I started telling people what they were and were not allowed to do to me or treat me like, when I started putting limits on what I'd accept from people, that didn't improve my relationships. It dissolved them. When I started telling people what I would tolerate, what I would not tolerate, it didn't encourage them to want to treat me better. It simply told them I wasn't welcome in their life anymore. See, the people that I was hanging out with, the only value I had to them was the sacrifices I was willing to make for them. And when I stopped wasn't willing to make those sacrifices, there was nothing about me that they actually wanted, that they actually liked. So when I started putting up boundaries and saying, I won't tolerate being treated this way any longer, they just left. So using boundaries for me ended up making me lonely, created a place where I had no people. So then I stopped using boundaries and just went back to people pleasing because it was better to have shitty people in my life than it was to have no people in my life. And of course, that didn't improve my mood. It didn't improve my quality of life. It didn't give me positive relationships, but it did give me relationships, just really harmful and toxic ones. And as most people pleasers, especially us guys who are people pleasers, as we often turn out, we become toxic. I became toxic to my family, to my wife. And even after my wife left several years ago, I even became toxic to the girl I dated afterwards. I became toxic to a lot of people, as most of us people pleasers eventually do, especially the guys. So what do I do? People pleasing wasn't working. Boundaries, which is supposed to be the answers to people pleasers, wasn't working. So what I did is after a lot of internal thought, self-discovery, personal coaching. I had a coach of my own. Being homeless, living with people who who didn't at all want what I want, didn't share my values even in the slightest, trying to find help from traditional sources and them all not understanding the problem. After years of that, online research and talking to people and getting coworkers, getting help from coworkers, and just after years of trying to figure out a solution to this problem, I eventually had an epiphany. The problem wasn't that I needed boundaries. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that I didn't know how to use boundaries. Because the way I understood boundaries, in the way most people understand boundaries, is we teach people how to treat us. And while that in some sense is true, if we teach them they can't treat us that way, it doesn't improve the relationship. It doesn't give them any incentive to want to treat us better. But what I discovered is if instead of using boundaries to tell people what they can and cannot do, what I will and won't tolerate, instead of making boundaries about what the other person does, what their values are, how they treat me, I made boundaries about myself. I created a system I call unconditional boundaries, where I use what I call bridges, a type of boundary called bridges, to communicate to people what my values are and make them about me. If I share my values with other people, then yes, most of the people currently in my life who only value the sacrifices I make for their benefit, they'll leave. I'll lose them, almost all of them. And I did. But what ended up happening is as I got more and more clear about what my values are, more and more people who shared those values began to enter my life. More and more people who wanted what I wanted began to enter my life. And I became casual friends with a lot of different people who wanted some of the same things I wanted. Now, right off the bat, they only wanted a few of the same things that I wanted, but they did want there was some things in common. There wasn't very many things, so I didn't have any close friends, but I was no longer alone. I didn't have any confidants, and I didn't have anybody to go to when shit got hard, but I wasn't alone anymore. And slowly, gradually, over time, I learned how to use this concept of unconditional boundaries, how to communicate my values to people. And I discovered two things. As I got better at communicating my values to people by setting bridges, by building bridges, and setting that kind of boundary that I call bridges, which communicate my boundaries, or sorry, when I got better at communicating what my values are, what I call setting bridges or building bridges, the better I got at that, the more people either would join my life, become a friend, or move on. I had a lot less, like literally 98% less conflict in my life because those people who didn't share my values, they just didn't invest in a relationship with me, nor I with them. I didn't have to please anybody anymore. I didn't have to beg for anybody's love and attention anymore because those who wanted what I wanted, who shared my values, would give it to me. They would give me their attention and they would value my attention because we shared some things. And sure, at first it was a matter of sitting down and watching movies with somebody else in the Airbnb I lived in. I rented a room in an Airbnb, and so as a result, there was other people who rented rooms there, and the people who shared some of my values, we would sit down and watch movies together. We weren't close friends, but there were some things we would share, some movies we would like, and we learned to discuss some of those things. What I found over time is as I got better at sharing my values, better at building bridges, I could build more bridges with those casual friends. And just like before, most of them wouldn't share my deeper values, so they'd move on. But a few of them would share some of those deeper values, and we'd get even closer. And as I kept inviting more people into my life by sharing my values and building bridges, and letting those people who didn't share my values to just drift away and move on, as I made more room in my life by letting those whose values were different than mine simply drift away, I had more room in my life for those people who did have similar values. And rather than investing my energy into building relationships, sacrificing myself to build relationships, I put my energy towards understanding my values, to self discovery, to self reflection, to understanding who I am, what I want. The more clear I got about that, the more clearly I was able to articulate that, the faster people would enter my life, the more often people would want to be a part of who I am and what I do. And over time, and this was over several years of time, I got a few very close friends. And I discovered that using unconditional boundaries, specifically the boundary I call bridges, created those very close friends. I also have several good friends that are not quite as close as those very close friends. I also have several friends that aren't good friends, they're not as close. I also have several casual friends that aren't as close as those friends. I've discovered that there are layers, there are levels, there are different types of friendships, depending on which values we share and which ones we don't. The more we share, the closer that we can become. The more important that those values are to each of us that we share, the closer that we become even more. And the more important the values we don't share, the more important it is we don't spend a whole lot of time and energy on each other. And either they drift away or I drift away, or we become casual friends and we just stay there. There are plenty of people that I share things like Lord of the Rings or Dungeons and Dragons or video games with that I actually don't share much else because a lot of our values aren't the same, but those things are. So we just share those. And today, as a result, I have a variety of friendships, of a variety of levels, of a variety of closeness. And I have a lot of different people I can call on for a lot of different reasons. And there's very few problems that I can't solve in my life. There's very few things that I can't recover from. I am rich in social connection, filthy rich in social connection. I have more people in my life than most people will meet in a year. People who want to be a part of my life. Not all of them do I talk to every day, but many of them I talk to on a fairly regular basis. And all of that happened because I figured out that boundaries aren't about telling people what to do. They're not about telling people what we will and won't tolerate. Unconditional boundaries are about communicating our values, our desires, our preferences. And when we do that, we attract people who want those things, who share those things. And that's why I wrote this book.